For almost all of our time on Earth, getting old was not something most humans planned for. It was something few people actually reached. The bodies of our ancestors were not built for long retirements. They were built for staying alive, in dangerous places where injuries, sickness, hunger, and giving birth decided how long a person could live. What we call old age today is not something that was normal for ancient humans. It is a rare thing that only became common very recently in the history of life on Earth. If most humans who ever lived never got to experience decades of slowing down, losing memory, and slowly getting old, then what exactly changed? Why did 90% of human history have no old age? When we say that most of human history had no old age, we are not saying that nobody ever got old. Old bones found at ancient burial sites show people who lived long enough for their joints to wear out, for their teeth to get worn down, and for broken bones to heal over many years. Some people made it to their 60s, and a few probably lived even longer than that. But the real point is different. Old age was not a common stage that most people went through. It happened, but it was rare enough that it did not change the way society was set up. For almost 300,000 years, since early humans first appeared, in Africa, most human groups were made up mostly of children, teenagers, and young adults. The number of people who lived far past the age when they could have children was small compared to everyone else. To understand this clearly, we need to look at two things that people often mix up: life expectancy at birth and the maximum age a human can live. Life expectancy at birth in ancient populations was low, often thought to be in the 20s or 30s. This does not mean that adults usually died at 30. It means that many children did not survive the earliest and most dangerous years of life. High death rates among babies and young kids pulled the average down. If a child survived past the early years, the chances of making it to 40 or 50 got better. Even so, making it into the late 60s or 70s was not common. The body might have been able to live longer, but the chance of actually reaching that age was limited by the dangers of everyday life. In small groups of hunter-gatherers, which is how early humans lived, group sizes were small. A group might have 20 to 50 people, sometimes a few more. In a group that small, even if one or two people lived to a very old age, they did not form a whole generation of older people. There was no large group of old folks shaping long-term rules, passing on land, or making big plans for the future. The age breakdown of those groups looked like a tall, narrow triangle: lots of young people, fewer middle-aged adults, and very few old people. This pattern is backed up by what we know about recent hunter-gatherer groups and also by the age ranges found in ancient burial sites. Burial grounds from the Upper Stone Age show mostly young adults, with very few skeletons identified as old. The world our species grew up in helps explain this. During the late Ice Age, the climate kept changing over and over. Food came and went. Groups moved around a lot across lands that required strong bodies. Death came from the outside more than from the inside. People more often died from sickness, injuries, problems during childbirth, or from not having enough food or shelter, rather than from the slow breakdown of the body that we think of as modern aging. In those days, life was often cut short by sudden dangers rather than stretched into decades of slowly getting weaker. None of this means that old people did not exist or were not cared for. Healed bones show that people were taken care of and helped. What it does mean is that getting old was not the usual outcome for most people. It was possible, but not normal. The early human body evolved in groups where surviving long enough to have children was the most important thing, and surviving long after having children was not guaranteed. If most humans throughout deep history never lived to experience long periods of aging, then having very few old people was not strange. It was the normal population picture that our species first grew from. If we look more closely at the age groups of early human communities, the absence of many old people becomes easier to understand in simple terms. Imagine a small group of early humans living in eastern Africa around 200,000 years ago, near the kinds of landscapes where our species first appeared. That group would probably include several families related to each other. There would be lots of children. Young adults would be doing most of the hard physical work needed to survive. A few middle-aged people would carry experience and memories. Truly old people, those well past the age of having children, would be rare enough that they would really stand out. This was not because people chose not to value old age. It was the natural result of numbers shaped by the world and by biology. Many babies and children dying early reduced the number of people who even made it to adulthood. Those who did survive to have children still faced serious risks from hunting accidents, diseases, fighting, and childbirth. Each new danger made the number of older people even smaller. Over thousands of generations, this created a steady pattern where most people were young and only a small number actually grew visibly old. Findings from ancient burial sites back this up. When scientists look at old bones from prehistoric burial grounds, they figure out age at death by looking at tooth wear, bone growth, and joint damage. The spread of ages is never even. Instead, it bunches up heavily around young adulthood, with fewer people identified as old. This does not mean that ancient people could never live a long time. It just means that the share of old people in any given community was small. In a settlement of 30 people, maybe one person might be over 60, sometimes none at all. In everyday life, that difference really matters. A society with one old person is not set up the same way as a society where 1/3 of the people are over 65. Numbers change the social role that age plays. In early human groups, people were always moving. They followed animal herds and plant cycles with the seasons. There was only so much food they could carry or find. Food had to be collected or hunted again and again. Under those conditions, a group made up mostly of strong, active adults worked best. The age breakdown matched what the environment needed. There was not enough extra food to support large numbers of people who could not fully help with finding food. That reality did not get rid of caring for others or working together, but it did limit how common it could be for many old, dependent people to exist at once. When we compare this to modern industrial societies, the difference is huge. Today, in many countries, a large part of the population is old. Whole systems, retirement plans, healthcare, housing between generations, are built around the fact that people live a long time. For most of human history, those kinds of systems would not have been needed because not enough people were old enough to require them. The way society worked evolved in communities where old people were respected, but few. The idea of spending many years beyond your active working life was not something early humans planned for. Going back to our origins in Africa, the earliest early humans lived in environments that demanded flexibility. Living a long time past the years of having children might have helped pass down knowledge, but it did not become the norm for most people. Natural selection works on who survives and has babies, not on hopes. If most people did not live far into old age, then the center of the population stayed with the young. In that way, the lack of widespread old age was not weird in the past. It was the normal starting point from which our species spread across the world. When we imagine early human life, it is tempting to picture a long line of grandparents, parents, and children living together for many decades. That image feels natural to us because today, living a long time is normal. But for most of the time since early humans first appeared in Africa, the overlap between generations was narrower. There were generations, but they were squeezed closer together. A grandparent and a grandchild might overlap in time, though it was not guaranteed, and it was often shorter than what we expect today. Life moved faster, from birth to having children to becoming weak. This squeeze shaped how memories, skills, and history were passed down. In small hunter-gatherer groups, knowledge about the land, seasons, animal behavior, and friendships was really important. Older people who lived into later adulthood probably knew a lot of valuable things, but because there were so few of them, passing down knowledge did not depend on a large class of old people. Skills were spread out among active adults. Learning happened by doing things together rather than through long retirement years, meant for thinking and teaching. Because of how the population was set up, experience had to be shared before people got too old and weak. There was no promise of decades available for slowly getting worse. The biology backs this up. Aging happens slowly at the cell level, but we can only really see it in society when people live long enough for it to build up. In environments full of sickness, injuries, and not enough food, many lives ended before deep old age became easy to see. The body did not need to keep going through long periods of low productivity after having children, because those long periods were statistically uncommon. Natural selection mainly shapes things that affect having and raising babies. Once those tasks were mostly done, the pressure to keep the body running at full speed got weaker. This does not mean that evolution ignored later life completely. People past the age of having children could still help by caring for children, sharing food, and keeping the group together, but their contribution worked within a group where they were a small minority. Old bones give us small hints of this squeeze. Bone studies often show adults who died between 30 and 50, with fewer clearly identified as being past 60. Joint damage appears, but not in huge numbers. Tooth loss and wear are there, but not at extreme levels across all samples. The pattern suggests that while aging happened in the body as it does today, fewer people lived long enough to go through all of it. From the lens of deep history, the human lifespan was shaped less by long internal decline and more by outside dangers. Going back to where our species started, the early African landscapes were moving and sometimes harsh. Being able to move around, work together, and stay physically strong were key to surviving. Under those conditions, the center of the population by age stayed in youth and middle adulthood. The idea of living through a long stretch defined mainly by getting old was not part of daily planning. Social bonds formed across generations, but they were not built around a large number of old people. For almost 90% of human history, old age existed as something that could happen rather than as a normal stage. It was present at the edges of communities, not at their center. Understanding this tight squeeze of generations helps make clear what people mean when they say that most of our past had no old age. It was not that aging itself was absent, but that a long, widespread phase of being old is what sets deep human history apart from today. To understand why old age stayed rare for most of human history, we have to look past bones and numbers and go back to the environments in which our species first formed. Early humans appeared in Africa during the late Ice Age, a time marked by changing weather rather than stability. Rain patterns shifted, grasslands grew and shrank, lakes came and went. The landscapes that shaped early human life were not still backgrounds, but moving systems that required people to stay flexible. In those conditions, staying alive depended on moving around, working together, and being able to react quickly to change. These facts about the environment shaped how long people typically lived, not by speeding up how the body aged, but by raising the chances of danger. Early human groups moved often across territories to follow the food that changed with seasons. Hunting large animals required teamwork and strong bodies. Gathering plant foods required knowing where things grew and when. Water sources could dry up without warning. A sudden dry spell or cold snap could cut off food. These pressures did not slowly wear the body down over decades. They created sudden problems that could end a life quickly. An injury from hunting, a fall, an animal attack, or a fight could become deadly without a doctor to help. A wound that could be treated easily today could turn life-threatening in just a few days. Infection was always present in environments without clean water or medicines. In that kind of world, people often died before the slow processes of deep aging even became visible. Changes in climate made things worse. During ice ages and warmer periods, African environments went through repeated changes in temperature and rainfall. Groups grew and shrank in response. Findings from ancient sites show times when groups moved out of Africa and later pulled back into safer areas. These population changes suggest that human groups were tested again and again by hard environmental conditions. When resources ran low, weaker people, including the very young and the very old, were more at risk. Over tens of thousands of years, this pattern shaped a population made up mostly of people in their physically active years. This does not mean that old people were abandoned or left out. Signs of healed fractures and people surviving for a long time with disabilities show that care and cooperation were part of life. But care itself took energy and food, both of which were limited by environmental constraints. In small groups of maybe 30 or 40 people, there was not much room to spare. How many people a group could support depended on being able to move and find food when it was available. A large number of people who needed help, whether babies or old people, put pressure on the group's resources. The balance of ages that lasted through most of the Ice Age reflects this reality. Many children were born, many did not survive their early years, and relatively few people reached old age. Going back to the starting point of our species makes clear the scale of time involved. For almost 300,000 years, human life unfolded in hunter-gatherer environments shaped by changing climates and local dangers. Farming, staying in one place, and modern medicine make up only a tiny slice of that time. The environments that shaped our bodies were not built around steady food or safe living conditions. They were built around adaptation and movement. Under those pressures, life expectancy stayed low not because the human body couldn't live long, but because the environment kept getting in the way. In that deep setting in history, The rarity of old age was not an accident, it was a reflection of how staying alive worked in the places where our species began. Beyond climate and movement, the everyday details of life further limited how often humans made it to old age. Early humans lived within food systems that required constant effort. Large game animals provided a lot of calories but were dangerous. Smaller animals took time and energy. Plant foods changed by season and location. The food landscape was not steady. Times of relative plenty were followed by shortage. Even in resource-rich parts of eastern and southern Africa, change shaped survival. When rain patterns shifted or animal herds moved unpredictably, human groups had to adjust fast. In those systems, a single failed hunt or a long dry spell could weaken people who were already close to the edge of good health. Food directly affects how strong the body is. Repeated cycles of going without and then recovering put stress on the body. While the human body is remarkably adaptable, long periods of not enough food or occasional famine make people more likely to get sick and less able to recover from injury. Over decades, those pressures build up, yet many people did not even live those decades. The combination of environmental uncertainty and limited medical knowledge meant that survival often depended on being physically strong right then and there. People in the best years of adulthood were more likely to make it through. The very young and the very old were more at risk when food was scarce. Animals and competition added another layer. Early humans shared the land with large meat-eating animals. Although working together and using tools reduced the danger, it did not get rid of it. Living in open grasslands, wooded areas, and near water sources put groups in the path of animals that were both prey and danger. Staying safe required being able to move fast and stay alert. An aging body with slower reactions or less energy faced more trouble in those situations. This fact about the environment does not suggest that old people were deliberately pushed out, but it helps explain why the world naturally filtered the population toward those in their most physically capable years. Disease also shaped how long people lived. Before the rise of large farming settlements, large disease outbreaks were less common, yet local infections were always around. Parasites, stomach bugs, and wound infections spread through small groups. Without medicines or clean wound care, small injuries could get worse fast. A younger adult's body might fight off those threats more successfully than an older person's body. Over long stretches of time, these biological and environmental interactions influenced which age groups were most likely to survive. Ancient signs of movement, temporary campsites, stone tool piles, and seasonal use of certain areas show that early humans did not stay long in one place. Moving around reduces some disease risks, but increases exposure to environmental dangers. Traveling long distances over rough terrain means a higher chance of falls and broken bones. While some broken bones healed, as old bones confirm, others probably meant death. The ability to bounce back from injury goes down with age. In a world without surgery, this decline had real consequences. Going back to where our species began in Africa helps keep things in perspective. For the vast majority of human history, life unfolded in ecosystems that rewarded flexibility and physical strength. Living long past the age of having children may have offered social benefits, yet it happened within a very small portion of the population. The environment did not support a large number of people living for decades past their most active and useful years. Instead, it kept a structure where young people and young adults were the majority. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore not simply a feature of biology, but the result of environmental balance operating over hundreds of thousands of years. Environmental pressure did not only work through dramatic events like drought or being attacked by animals, it worked quietly through energy balance. Every living thing exists within a budget of calories taken in and calories used up. For early humans, that budget was tight. Food had to be found, prepared, and shared. Water had to be carried or reached. Shelter had to be built or found. In moving hunter-gatherer societies, energy use was non-stop. Walking long distances, climbing, digging, lifting, and making tools demanded sustained physical effort. Under those conditions, the body's energy was focused on keeping the person alive right now and able to have children. There was almost no extra energy available for long periods of low productivity. This math shaped who could survive through time. In a landscape without stored extra food, each additional person who needed help increased pressure on the group. Babies needed care, and their survival ensured that life continued. Adults in their prime produced most of the food and protection. Older people, especially those slowing down physically, depended more on group support. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherers show that old people often contribute knowledge, childcare, and help solve conflicts. Yet these contributions happen within small groups where numbers stay limited. If only a few people survived into old age, their presence added value to the group without overwhelming its energy budget. If many did, the ecological balance would shift. Over hundreds of thousands of years, environments that did not regularly support large numbers of old people helped maintain a population shaped by youth. The energy demands of pregnancy and breastfeeding also interacted with environmental limits. Women's bodies invest a lot in having children. In times of not enough food, fertility can drop, spacing births further apart. Yet high infant mortality often led to getting pregnant again and again. This cycle further wore down women's health and increased the risk of dying. In that kind of system, many women did not reach old age, not because they aged faster, but because the strain of having children combined with not having enough food. The combined effect reinforced a population structure where few people experienced decades. Past the years of raising children, seasonal changes made this pattern stronger. During times of plenty, groups could support a wider range of ages. During scarcity, risk went up. Older adults, whose muscle mass and ability to fight sickness naturally go down with age, faced bigger danger when food was limited or temperatures dropped. Over evolutionary time, this seasonal filtering shaped the share of old people in communities. It did not wipe them out, but it kept their numbers small. Going back to the African origins of our species makes the scale clear. For almost 90% of human history, life unfolded within ecosystems that required constant management of energy. There were no grain storehouses, no large enough permanent food stores to buffer multiple bad years, no organized safety nets. The body that evolved under those conditions is capable of a long life, yet it evolved in populations where actually reaching that potential was uncommon. The rarity of old age, therefore, was not only about the body slowing down, it was a reflection of the economics of the environment. The landscapes where humans first became human did not regularly create the extra resources needed to support large numbers of people far past their most productive years. In that quiet math of calories and care, the demographic youthfulness of early humanity was continually reinforced. If the environment limited how often humans reached old age, the structure of the human body also reflects the priorities of natural selection. Evolution does not design organisms with future comfort in mind. It shapes traits that increase the chance of surviving long enough to have and raise children. Once those tasks are mostly done, the intensity of selection weakens. This principle, supported by evolutionary biology, helps explain why the human body is capable of living a long time, but not built for decades of gradually getting worse. The earliest early humans in Africa inherited biological systems shaped by millions of years of evolution under conditions of uncertainty. Muscles, bones, immune responses, and metabolic systems were tuned for endurance, movement, and fertility. They were not tuned for long, slow aging across many decades because statistically, few people reach that stage. The force of natural selection goes down with age. Harmful mutations that show up early in life are strongly selected against because they reduce the chance of having babies. Mutations that show up after having children are less strongly filtered because their effect on passing down genes is smaller over long spans of time. This dynamic allows late-acting weaknesses to stay in populations. The result is not a deliberate design flaw, but a predictable pattern. The body keeps itself running well through the years of having children and then slowly loses resilience afterward. In prehistoric populations where outside dangers were common, many people did not live long enough for late-acting weaknesses to become widespread. This means that the evolutionary investment in long-term upkeep stayed limited. The concept of antagonistic pleiotropy further clarifies this pattern. Some biological traits that help a person survive or have children early in life may have costs later on. For example, metabolic systems that store energy efficiently help survival during food shortages and support having children. Yet over long periods, such efficiency can contribute to chronic health conditions in modern environments where food is plentiful. In ancestral settings marked by variable food supply, the early life benefits outweighed late life costs. Since relatively few people survived into extended old age, the later consequences put less pressure on evolution. This biological logic unfolded within the African landscapes where early humans came from. in small groups navigating changing climates. The main evolutionary challenge was to reach the age of having children and successfully raise them. A body capable of surviving to 40 or 50 and contributing to the next generation was enough for genes to carry on. Living longer than that could provide social advantages like sharing knowledge and helping with childcare. But those advantages worked within a small minority. They did not redefine the central evolutionary target. Evidence from comparing different animals supports this interpretation. Many mammals show a pattern where survival drops significantly after the years of having children. Humans are unusual in having a relatively long post-reproductive lifespan compared to other primates, especially females. Yet even this extended lifespan did not translate into a large elderly population in deep history. The potential for a long life existed, but environmental and biological constraints limited how often it was realized. The body's gradual decline after middle age, reduced muscle mass, slower cell repair, increasing chances of getting sick, is not a recent problem. It reflects evolutionary priorities shaped in contexts where prolonged old age was uncommon. Going back to the central question, the rarity of old age for most of human history was not simply caused by harsh environments. It was also built into the biological structure of a species optimized for survival through reproduction, rather than for extended aging. The gradual decline of the body after middle age is not a sudden failure, but a shift in balance. Cells build up damage over time from normal metabolic processes. DNA repair systems fix much of this damage, yet not perfectly. Proteins bend the wrong way. Oxidative stress increases and tissues slowly lose flexibility. These processes happen in every human body regardless of era. What differs across history is how long people live with these accumulating changes. In early human populations, many lives ended before cell-level aging reached advanced stages. The biological machinery for repair and maintenance evolved to be good enough for survival through the years of having children, not to guarantee many additional decades. This pattern aligns with an evolutionary idea known as the disposable soma hypothesis. According to this framework, living things divide their limited energy between reproduction and long-term body upkeep. When resources are scarce, prioritizing reproduction ensures genes are passed on, even if upkeep is imperfect. In the changing African environments where our species first formed, that allocation made sense. Energy put into producing and nurturing children could outweigh energy put into perfect cell repair. Across a long old age, over thousands of generations, this trade-off shaped the body we have today. Bone density shows this dynamic. During youth and early adulthood, bone mass increases, reaching a peak that supports physical activity and reproduction. After middle age, bone density gradually goes down. In modern societies with long life expectancy, this decline can lead to broken bones. In old age, in prehistoric settings, however, fewer people survived long enough for widespread weak bone fractures to pile up. The biological tendency toward bone loss existed, but its full effect across the population was limited by people dying earlier from other causes. Muscle mass follows a similar path. Peak strength supports hunting, gathering, and getting around. After the reproductive years, muscle slowly decreases. In a context without plentiful food, keeping high muscle mass into old age was very costly. In terms of energy, natural selection did not strongly favor ways to prevent this decline beyond the age when having children was mostly done. The immune system also reflects age-dependent change. The immune system is strong in early adulthood, but gradually weakens with age. In environments without antibiotics, this weakening raised the risk of infection. Yet because many people did not reach very old ages, the widespread effect of a weakening immune system stayed limited. The body's aging processes unfolded quietly within a small part of the population. Going back to where our species started helps make the scale of these dynamics clear. For almost 300,000 years, humans lived in small groups. Navigating environmental uncertainty, selection pressures focused on early survival, fertility, and raising children successfully. Let life decline, while biologically real, did not dominate the evolutionary landscape because relatively few people experienced prolonged old age. The result is a species capable of long life, yet not biologically optimized for decades of slow aging. The rarity of old age across most of human history was therefore tied to cellular trade-offs embedded in our bodies. Aging was always present, but its extended expression across large populations is a recent population development. rather than an ancient norm. Human aging also reflects a subtle distinction between what the body is capable of and what evolution actually prepared it for. The human body contains mechanisms that allow for a long life under the right conditions. Telomere maintenance, DNA repair enzymes, antioxidant systems, and hormonal regulation all contribute to living longer. None of these systems were absent in prehistoric humans. What differs across time is the likelihood that people could live long enough for these mechanisms to keep them going into old age. Evolution does not get rid of longevity. It decides how much energy is dedicated to preserving it. In ancestral African environments where early humans first expanded, the average life was shaped by early reproduction and physical work. Puberty marked a move into roles tied directly to finding food and participating in society. Fertility typically began earlier than in many modern societies. With earlier having of children came earlier parental investment. This compressed timeline meant that much of an individual's evolutionary impact happened in the first half of life. From the perspective of passing down genes, surviving into the 40s could be enough. Beyond that point, the evolutionary returns went down even though social contributions could continue. One example of extended post-reproductive life in humans is menopause. Compared to other primates, human females often live many years after fertility ends. Some evolutionary models suggest that grandmothers helping with children may have helped offspring survive, indirectly favoring longer female lifespans. Yet even if such things happened, they worked within small populations. The presence of some long-lived people did not create a broad group of old people in the population. It created a minority who contributed through knowledge, childcare, and social stability. Their existence enriched communities, but did not shift the overall age distribution toward prolonged aging. The male life course followed different patterns often shaped by risk-taking and physical competition. Injury, conflict, and hunting dangers likely reduced survival in middle adulthood. Old bones from prehistoric contexts show evidence of trauma, consistent with physically demanding lives, even when injuries healed. The buildup of strain reduced resilience. The biological capacity to age slowly remained, but exposure to danger limited its expression. The evolutionary design of humans therefore has two sides to it. On one hand, we are capable of living into our 70s and beyond under supportive conditions. On the other hand, our bodies were shaped in populations where most individuals did not routinely experience such extended years. Cellular aging processes, hormonal shifts, and muscle and bone decline unfold predictably with time. Yet for the vast majority of human history, environmental and social pressures cut life short before deep old age became widespread. Going back to the African origins of our species emphasizes this long baseline. For almost 90% of human existence, small groups navigated landscapes without clean water systems, antibiotics, or steady food supplies. Selection pressures favored survival through reproductive maturity and the successful raising of children. Living long past that was possible, but not statistically central. The human body, as it evolved, reflects this balance. It carries the tools for a long life, but it was not built in a world where old age would become a common demographic experience. One of the strongest forces shaping the age structure of early humans was not the death of the old, but the vulnerability of the very young. In prehistoric populations, infant and child death rates were high by modern standards. This single population factor dramatically lowered average life expectancy and reshaped the visible structure of communities. When many children died before reaching adulthood, the proportion of the population that survives into later decades becomes smaller. Even if some people are biologically capable of living a long life, to understand why most of human history had no widespread old age, we must start with the earliest years of life. In the African environments where early humans first appeared, giving birth itself carried significant risk. Without surgery, antibiotics, or good birth care, complications during delivery could threaten both mother and baby. Even when birth was successful, survival in the first year depended on food, the mother's health, and protection from infection. Breastfeeding provided immune support, yet it also tied the baby's survival closely to the mother's survival. If a mother died or became seriously ill, her baby's chances dropped sharply. These biological ties made early death more likely. Infectious disease played a constant role. Although small moving groups may have avoided large outbreaks, local infections were always around. Stomach bugs, breathing infections, and parasitic diseases could be deadly for babies with still developing immune systems. In environments without clean water or controlled sanitation, exposure to germs was constant. Many children probably died from illnesses that are easily treated today. From a population perspective, each infant death pulled the average lifespan down. A community could have people who reach 50 or 60 yet still show a low overall life expectancy because many never passed early childhood. Nutritional stress added another layer. Seasonal changes in food availability meant that infants and young children were especially vulnerable during lean times. Weaning introduced new risks as children shifted from breast milk to foraged foods that might be less reliable or harder to digest. Growing requires steady caloric intake and vitamins. Shortfalls in either raised the chance of getting sick and caused developmental problems. Over thousands of generations, this vulnerability shaped the population picture. Many were born, fewer survived to adulthood, still fewer reached old age. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. Burial sites from prehistoric contexts often contain a high proportion of children's remains. Age estimates based on tooth development and bone growth reveal significant death in early life. This pattern is not unique to one region, but appears across multiple prehistoric populations. It reflects a structural reality rather than isolated events. When a population consistently loses a large fraction of its youngest members, the base of the population picture remains wide while its upper levels remain narrow. Going back to the origin of our species reinforces the scale of this influence. For almost 300 years, human communities operated without modern medical systems. Childhood survival depended on the mother's health, group support, and environmental stability. Each baby who did not survive changed the statistical picture of the population. Even if the biological potential for a long life existed, the population pathway to reach it was narrow. In this way, the fragility of early life indirectly limited the visibility of old age. A society in which many people do not reach adulthood cannot produce a large class of old people. The absence of widespread old age was therefore linked not only to how long adults lived, but to how many children survived long enough to become adults at all. The vulnerability of early childhood did more than reduce averages. It reshaped how generations overlapped. In small hunter-gatherer communities, a child who survived the first few years had already passed through one of the most dangerous phases of life. Yet even after infancy, risks stayed high. Falls, burns, animal encounters, and untreated infections could end a young life quickly. The environment in which early humans first spread across Africa was not made for safety. Open fires, sharp tools, uneven ground, and exposure to the weather were part of everyday life. Childhood unfolded within the same physical world as adulthood, without the protection common in modern societies. Because death was concentrated in the earliest years, each generation got smaller before it grew up. If many children were born, but fewer survived into their teen years, the population base got thinner as it rose. This pattern affected the likelihood that people would live long enough to become grandparents. For a grandparent generation to be common, two conditions must both be true. Children must survive to adulthood and adults must survive long after having children. In prehistoric contexts, both pathways were fragile. High child death rates meant that fewer people entered adulthood. Adult death from environmental and biological causes further reduced the numbers who could progress into old age. The result was a compressed generational ladder. Archaeological data from various prehistoric sites reveal this narrowing effect. Age at death profiles reconstructed from dental and skeletal analysis often show substantial juvenile death followed by a concentration of deaths in young and middle adulthood. Individuals clearly identified as elderly appear, but they are a minority. This does not imply that care was absent. On the contrary, evidence of healed injuries in children suggests attentive social support. Yet even with cooperation, biological vulnerability remained. High-breathing infection in a child without modern treatment could escalate rapidly. A small wound could become a bigger problem. These quiet biological realities operated continuously in early human communities. Nutrition and growth also shape long-term survival. Early developmental stress can have lasting physical consequences. If a child went through repeated infections or malnutrition, their immune system and organ development might be weakened. Such early life stress can influence the chance of getting sick later in life. In prehistoric populations where food stability was uncertain, these cumulative effects may have reduced the chance of reaching old age. even for those who survived childhood. Going back to the origins of our species makes the time scale of these pressures clear. For almost 90% of human history, life unfolded without vaccines, antibiotics, or children's medicine. Childhood survival depended on the mother's health, breastfeeding, food availability, and group protection. Each generation had to pass through narrow biological gates before adulthood. The more fragile these gates, the fewer people came through to form an older generation decades later. In this way, the absence of widespread old age was partly the echo of childhood vulnerability. A society cannot sustain a large population of old people if a significant portion of its children do not reach maturity. The population structure of early humanity was shaped at the beginning of life, long before the processes of aging became visible. When we step back and look at early human populations, across deep time, childhood death becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a structural force that shaped how societies perceived time itself. In communities where many children did not survive to adulthood, the continuity of generations was fragile. Each child who survived represented a huge investment of energy, protection, and hope. The uncertainty of early life made the move into the teen years and adulthood a major turning point. Yet because this turning point was hard to cross, the number of people who could later become old people remained proportionally small. This population narrowing began at birth and echoed forward through decades. The emotional and social consequences of this pattern likely influenced how early humans organized care and cooperation. High infant death does not imply indifference. On the contrary, the evolutionary value of children would have intensified how much parents invested. Research on small-scale societies today shows extensive communal involvement in childcare. Cooperative breeding, where relatives and non-parents help raise children, is a well-documented feature of human social systems. Such cooperation may have evolved partly in response to the vulnerability of early life. Yet even with collective support, the biological risks of infancy and early childhood remain substantial in environments without modern medicine. This persistent fragility ensured that not every birth would result in a mature adult decades later. From a population perspective, this pattern continually constrained the upper layers of the age structure. Imagine a group of 40 people in a late Ice Age African landscape. If half of all children born into that group failed to survive early childhood, the pool of future adults was immediately cut in half. Those who did reach adulthood then faced additional hazards from injury, infection, and childbirth. Each stage filtered the population further. By the time a group of people approached 60 years of age, only a fraction of the original births remained. The rarity of old people was therefore not a single-stage outcome, but the cumulative result of multiple filters operating across the life course. Archaeological burial sites provide quiet confirmation of this pattern. High proportions of children's remains indicate that many lives ended before adulthood, while some burial sites show individuals who lived into old age. Their relative scarcity lines up with population modeling of high early death rate societies. These skeletal distributions do not tell personal stories, but they outline structural realities. A wide base of births combined with substantial early loss produces a narrow top. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this demographic shape became a stable feature of human existence. Going back to the origins of early humans in Africa reinforces the size of this time span. For almost 300,000 years, childhood survival was uncertain in ways that would be unfamiliar to most people in modern societies. The absence of vaccines, antiseptics, and controlled environments meant that many lives ended quietly and early. Even if the human body carried the potential for a long life, the pathway to reach old age was statistically narrow from the beginning. In this sense, the rarity of old age across most of human history was rooted as much in the fragility of infancy as in the decline of later years. The population story of aging begins at birth, and for most of our past, that beginning was the most uncertain stage of all. In addition to childhood vulnerability, the physical risks of adult life further limited how often humans reached old age. Early humans lived in environments where daily survival required direct engagement with the natural world, hunting large animals, processing carcasses with stone tools, climbing uneven terrain, and traveling long distances were routine activities. Each carried the possibility of injury. In a world without surgery, antiseptics, or antibiotics, even a small wound could become fatal. Infection was not an abstract threat, but a constant presence. A deep cut from a sharp stone edge or an animal's tusk could introduce bacteria that the body might not be able to fight off. Fever, blood poisoning, and system-wide complications could follow. Many adults probably died not from slow internal decline, but from injuries sustained during otherwise ordinary tasks. Old bones from prehistoric contexts provide quiet testimony to both resilience and risk. Anthropologists have documented healed fractures, suggesting that some individuals survived major trauma and were cared for by their communities. Yet the presence of healed injuries also implies that many other injuries did not heal. The archaeological record preserves only those who survived long enough for bone to remodel. It cannot capture the countless soft tissue infections or untreated internal injuries that ended lives more quickly. This selective visibility reminds us that surviving into middle age was not guaranteed, and surviving into old age even less so. Childbirth added another layer of adult death, particularly for women. Without modern obstetric care, complications such as blocked labor, heavy bleeding, or infection could be life-threatening. The human pelvis, shaped for walking upright, creates a narrow birth canal relative to a baby's head size. This anatomical balance, which is good for walking, increases delivery risk. In small prehistoric groups, a mother dying would have had cascading effects on her children's survival and on the group's stability. Repeated pregnancies, which were common in societies without modern birth control, compounded these risks. Many women probably did not survive through multiple childbirths, further reducing the number who might reach old age. Infectious disease also affected adults directly. While dense urban epidemics were rare before farming, localized outbreaks of pathogens were constant. Stomach diseases from contaminated water, breathing infections in close groups, and parasitic infestations were always around. The immune system can overcome many infections, but repeated exposure weakens resilience. In environments shaped by changing climate and limited nutrition, recovery was uncertain. An illness that a well-fed modern person might survive could become fatal under nutritional stress. Going back to the African origins of our species makes the long baseline of these hazards clear. For almost 300,000 years, human adults operated without medical systems capable of reliably preventing infection or managing trauma. Survival required physical strength, cooperation, and endurance. Those who reached 40 or 50 had already navigated decades of risk. Each additional year increased cumulative exposure to injury and disease. The rarity of old age was therefore reinforced by the ordinary dangers of adulthood. Death often came through sudden events rather than prolonged decline. In that kind of context, aging as a long, visible process stayed statistically uncommon. The demographic youthfulness of early humanity was sustained not only by childhood death and evolutionary trade-offs, but also by the constant physical hazards woven into adult life. Beyond visible injuries and dramatic events, there were quieter forms of physical wear that shaped adult survival long before old age could emerge. Repetitive physical strain left marks on bones and joints. Making stone tools required forceful repeated motions of the hands and shoulders. Carrying water, firewood, and food over long distances put stress on the spine and hips. Grinding plant materials with stone implements demanded sustained upper body effort over years. These tasks produce degenerative changes that are visible in bones from prehistoric populations. Arthritis, spinal compression, and joint remodeling appear in adults who probably did not live very far into what we would call old age. These signs indicate that the body's tissues were put under intense mechanical demand throughout adulthood. In an environment without pain management or orthopedic care, chronic bone and joint damage could reduce movement and productivity. Reduced mobility in a small foraging group carried practical consequences. Hunting and gathering required coordinated movement. An adult with serious joint damage or chronic back pain may have depended more heavily on others for food. While cooperation and food sharing were central features of early human societies, resource limits constrained how many dependent adults could be supported at once. Chronic impairment increased vulnerability during times of scarcity. A temporary food shortage that a healthy adult might endure could prove fatal for someone already weakened by long-term strain. Dental health offers another window into these accumulated stresses. Archaeological studies of early humans and other prehistoric populations reveal extensive tooth wear, fractures, and abscesses. Diets that included unprocessed plant fibers, grit from stone grinding, and tough animal tissue sped up enamel erosion. Dental infections could spread beyond the mouth, leading to complications throughout the body. Without antibiotics or surgical extraction, a dental abscess could become life-threatening. Such conditions might develop in middle age rather than in old age, cutting lifespans short before prolonged declining health became common. Nutritional changes also influenced adult resilience. Seasonal food shortages could lead to periodic undernutrition. Repeated cycles of weight loss and recovery put metabolic strain on the body. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies affect the immune system and wound healing. Even when caloric intake was sufficient overall, imbalances in vitamins and minerals could weaken long-term health. These cumulative stresses do not always leave clear marks on bones, yet they shape survival chances across decades. Going back to the African environments where early humans first evolved highlights the continuity of these pressures. For almost 300,000 years, adults engaged in physically demanding daily work without technological tools to reduce strain. There were no machines to lighten loads, no ergonomic adjustments, no chronic disease management systems. Survival required endurance sustained over many seasons. In those contexts, the body often reached its limits in middle age rather than in an extended old age. The rarity of a large elderly population was reinforced not only by sudden trauma, but by the buildup of mechanical and physiological wear. Aging did occur biologically, yet the pathway to experience it fully across many decades was narrow. Many adults encountered thresholds of strain, infection, or nutritional stress that ended life before old age became widespread. Illness in prehistoric life was rarely categorized as a chronic disease the way we understand it today. Instead, many conditions that would now be managed over decades likely unfolded more quickly, and with fewer opportunities for intervention. Infections that might be treated with antibiotics in the modern world could escalate rapidly in small mobile communities. A breathing infection could progress to pneumonia. A stomach illness could lead to severe dehydration that could threaten survival without controlled sanitation. Access to clean water was uncertain and contamination could happen at multiple points during daily survival tasks. In such circumstances, the line between temporary illness and fatal outcome was thin. The immune system is powerful, yet it is not perfect. Age itself gradually changes immune response, but in prehistoric settings, repeated exposure to germs combined with nutritional stress could compromise resilience. Even in middle age, adults who had already endured years of physical labor and periodic scarcity might face infection with reduced ability to recover. The absence of medical systems meant that survival depended almost entirely on the body's own defenses and the supportive care of others. If a fever went too high or infection spread throughout the body, options were limited. Many lives probably ended during episodes that in a modern hospital would be considered treatable. Parasites added another persistent burden. Intestinal worms and other parasitic infections can stay in the body for extended periods, gradually weakening nutritional status. Chronic parasitic load reduces iron levels, impairs growth, and diminishes immune efficiency. In prehistoric environments where exposure to soil, water, and animal hosts was constant, parasitic infections were likely common. While not always immediately fatal, their cumulative effects could shorten lifespan indirectly by increasing vulnerability to other diseases. Such hidden burdens rarely leave dramatic skeletal traces, yet they shape population patterns across generations. Social transmission of disease also influenced adult survival. Even in small groups, close proximity facilitates the spread of germs. A single contagious illness could move through a group one person at a time. Although small population size limited the scale of outbreaks, compared to later agricultural societies, localized outbreaks could still have serious impact. If several adults became ill simultaneously, the group's ability to secure food and provide care went down. In fragile ecological settings, such disruptions could cascade into further deaths. Going back to the deep African past reminds us that these biological dynamics operated continuously. For almost 300,000 years, there were no vaccination programs, no antibiotic treatments, no organized disease monitoring. Each generation navigated infection with only the tools of natural immunity and communal support. In this long context, many adults probably died from illnesses that modern medicine has made survivable. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore reinforced not only by visible trauma and mechanical wear, but by the quiet persistence of infectious disease. Aging as a prolonged decline remained uncommon because many lives were interrupted by sudden or slow-building illness before deep old age could unfold across decades. The demographic youthfulness of early humanity was sustained in part by germs that operated invisibly yet persistently within the environments where our species began. Reproduction shaped the human life course in ways that quietly limited how often people reached old age. In early human communities, fertility began relatively soon after puberty. The move from adolescence to adulthood carried immediate social and biological consequences. Forming partnerships, having children, and contributing to the group's survival were not delayed into a long period of education or economic preparation. Life unfolded within a compressed arc where the years of having children occupied a central and often extended portion of adulthood. This structure influenced how both women and men survived. For women, pregnancy and childbirth represented recurring physical demands. Pregnancy requires substantial energy investment. Breastfeeding extends that investment for months or years. In environments characterized by changing food availability, the energy cost of reproduction could be significant. Repeated pregnancies, especially when spaced closely together due to high infant death, increased strain on the body. Each pregnancy carried risk of heavy bleeding, blocked labor, infection, or other complications. Without surgery or antiseptic practices, these risks were not rare occurrences. They were embedded within the reproductive process itself. Over multiple births, cumulative strain could reduce the likelihood of surviving into later decades. Male life courses were shaped differently, but were not free of reproductive pressure. Males often competed for status, mates, and resources, hunting large game, engaging in physical conflict, and asserting territorial presence increased exposure to injury. While cooperation was central to human survival, competition also formed part of social dynamics. Young and middle-aged men may have faced elevated risk through high-stakes activities tied to reproductive opportunity. These risks did not necessarily speed up biological aging, but they increased death rates before old age became common. The timing of reproduction also influenced generational overlap. When people began having children in their late teens or early 20s, the span between generations shortened. A person who became a parent at 20 could become a grandparent in their early 40s. Yet becoming a great-grandparent required surviving into the 60s or beyond. A threshold fewer people crossed. The generational ladder narrowed with each additional decade. Early reproduction thus interacted with environmental hazards to compress generational depth. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that birth intervals varied depending on breastfeeding duration and nutritional status. Extended breastfeeding can suppress ovulation, spacing births naturally. However, high infant death often led to shortened intervals as the stopping of breastfeeding after an infant's death restored fertility. This cycle increased the number of pregnancies a woman might experience over her lifetime, amplifying cumulative risk over many generations. This pattern limited the proportion of women who survived long past their reproductive years. Going back to the African origins of our species reinforces how long this reproductive structure lasted. For almost 300,000 years, human life unfolded without modern birth control, birthing care, or medical management of complications. Reproduction was central to social organization and survival, but it carried inherent biological cost. The human body evolved to balance fertility with maintenance, yet that balance did not prioritize decades of post-reproductive longevity for the majority. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore intertwined with the demands of sustaining new life. In deep human history, reproduction was not only the mechanism of continuity, it was also one of the forces that constrained how many people would grow old. The biological cost of reproduction did not end with childbirth. Parenting in early human societies required sustained physical and cognitive investment. Babies and young children are unusually dependent compared to the offspring of many other mammals. Learning before they can meaningfully help with survival tasks. This extended dependency is a defining feature of humans, yet the burden of supporting that dependency fell on adults whose own survival remained uncertain. The years spent raising children overlapped with the years when physical resilience began to gradually decline. In environments shaped by changing resources and constant movement, parenting added cumulative strain to bodies already engaged in demanding tasks. Women often carried babies while gathering food or traveling between camps. Breastfeeding increased caloric requirements. If food availability declined, maternal nutritional reserves could be depleted. Even after weaning, childcare remained labor-intensive, protecting children from environmental hazards, Teaching them skills and integrating them into social networks required time and energy. These investments helped offspring survive, yet they also extended the period during which adults faced heightened responsibility and physical stress. For men, providing roles often intensified during child-rearing years. Hunting larger or more dangerous prey could improve nutritional intake for dependent children, yet increased hunting effort also raised exposure to injury. The overlap between peak reproductive responsibility and peak subsistence activity created a period of life marked by high output and high risk. Adults who navigated this phase successfully might reach middle age with experience and knowledge, but many did not reach decades far beyond it. Population modeling of small-scale societies suggests that adult death rates remained significant, even after the hazards of childhood were past. The probability of surviving from age 15 to age 60 was far lower in prehistoric contexts than in most modern populations. Each successive decade reduced cohort size. By the time people approached what we would call late adulthood, only a fraction of the original group remained. Reproduction, while essential to species continuity, therefore interacted with environmental hazards to limit the proportion of people who could experience extended old age. The human reproductive pattern also influenced the distribution of caregiving across generations. In some evolutionary models, grandmothers contribute significantly to childcare and food gathering, indirectly enhancing the survival of grandchildren. This contribution may have supported the evolution of somewhat extended female lifespan compared to other primates. Yet even if such dynamics operated, they worked within small margins. The presence of some long-lived grandmothers does not imply a large elderly class. It suggests selective advantages for a minority who survive the cumulative risks of pregnancy, childbirth, infection, and environmental stress. Going back to the long African baseline reminds us that these patterns persisted across almost 300 years. The rhythm of early human life was anchored in reproduction and child-rearing under conditions of uncertainty. The energy directed toward sustaining new generations inevitably constrained the energy available for long-term body maintenance. In this balance, surviving into old age remained possible but statistically limited. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore inseparable from the biological and social demands of raising children in demanding environments. Reproduction also shaped the timing of life in a way that compressed expectations about aging. In early human communities, the transition from childhood to reproductive maturity occurred without long institutional delays. Puberty marked entry into roles that carried immediate consequences for survival and continuity. Because fertility began relatively early, the interval between generations was short. A young woman who had her first child around the age of 20 could see that child reach their teen years while she was still in her 30s. If that child reproduced at a similar age, a grandparent might be only in their 40s. This rapid generational turnover meant that life stages unfolded quickly. Yet for a substantial class of old people to become common, two conditions had to be met repeatedly. People had to survive the demands of reproduction, and they had to persist for decades beyond it. In prehistoric environments, both conditions were uncertain. The cumulative strain of pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, and childcare reduced female survival chances over time. For males, the risks associated with providing food, territorial defense, and social competition also built up across early and middle adulthood. Each reproductive cycle extended the period of physical exposure to danger. Surviving into old age therefore required not only biological resilience, but also repeated avoidance of environmental and social risks over many decades. The population consequences were predictable. If a group began with a high number of births, then lost many in infancy, then lost additional members through adult hazards tied to survival and reproduction, only a small remainder would reach later decades. Even if those people contributed meaningfully as knowledge holders or caregivers, their numbers remained limited. The structure of the population thus remained centered on youth and active adulthood, rather than on prolonged old age. Anthropological comparisons with recent small-scale societies provide indirect insight into this pattern. In groups where reproduction begins early and continues through much of adulthood, generational overlap can be present but shallow. The presence of grandparents does not imply a large elderly population layer. It reflects survival through multiple demographic filters. For most of deep human history, these filters were strong. Going back to the African origins of early humans reinforces how long this reproductive structure persisted. For almost 300,000 years, there were no reliable means to control fertility or reduce birthing risk. The biological design of the human pelvis, the energy demands of breastfeeding, and the vulnerability of infants combined to anchor adulthood around reproduction. The body was shaped to balance fertility with survival long enough to raise children. It was not shaped in a context where most people would experience extended decades of post-reproductive life. In this light, the rarity of widespread old age becomes more understandable. The early human life course moved quickly from dependency to productivity to vulnerability. Reproduction ensured continuity, yet it also intensified exposure to risk across the very decades that might otherwise have led into prolonged aging. For the vast majority of human history, the demands of bringing new life into uncertain environments were inseparable from the limits placed on how many people would live long enough to become old. The archaeological record offers one of the clearest ways to examine how often people reached old age in deep human history. Bones survive long after soft tissues disappear, and within those bones are traces of lived experience. Anthropologists estimate age at death by examining dental wear, the fusion of growth plates, changes in the pelvis, and patterns of joint degeneration. These methods are not perfect, but when applied across many individuals, they reveal broad population patterns. In prehistoric burial sites associated with early humans and other late Ice Age populations, a consistent pattern emerges. Many people died in infancy, childhood, or early adulthood, and comparatively fewer reached what would be categorized as old age. Cemeteries from Upper Stone Age contexts across Africa and Eurasia provide examples of this structure. Children's remains are common. Young adults appear frequently. Individuals identified as over 60 are present, yet they form a small proportion of the total sample. This distribution does not imply that people were incapable of living longer. It indicates that the pathway to old age was statistically narrow. The bones of older individuals often show clear signs of degenerative change. Arthritic joints, spinal compression, and extensive tooth wear testify to years of physical labor and a gritty diet. Some skeletons reveal healed fractures that suggest long-term survival after injury, implying care within the group. These findings confirm that elderly individuals did exist, however. Their relative scarcity within burial sites lines up with demographic models of populations shaped by high early death rates and ongoing adult risk. The archaeological evidence therefore supports the idea that old age was present, but uncommon. Burial practices themselves provide additional context. In some prehistoric sites, individuals were buried with objects, pigments, or careful positioning, suggesting social recognition. The inclusion of elderly individuals within such practices indicates that age did not exclude someone from communal identity. Yet the small number of such burials reinforces the demographic reality that old people formed a minority. A society can respect age without being numerically dominated by it. Taphonomic factors must also be considered. Not all individuals who died were preserved or found. Some remains may have been lost to erosion, scavenging, or incomplete archaeological recovery. Even accounting for these limitations, the recurring pattern across multiple sites and regions suggests that old age was not widespread. When skeletal samples consistently show a concentration of deaths in younger age categories, the broader population picture becomes clearer. Going back to the African origins of our species anchors these findings in long-time scales. For almost 300,000 years, human life unfolded without modern medicine or sanitation. The bones recovered from prehistoric contexts represent only fragments of that span, yet they offer consistent signals. Most people did not accumulate the full skeletal signs of advanced old age, because many did not live long enough for those changes to become extreme. The archaeological record, therefore, aligns with ecological and biological evidence. Old age existed, but it did not define the demographic center of early humanity. The absence of a large elderly population is written not only in theory, but in the distribution of ancient bones. Estimating age from skeletal remains requires careful interpretation, and this process itself reveals how uncommon old age appears. In prehistoric samples, age at death is inferred from multiple indicators rather than a single marker. In children and adolescents, dental eruption and bone growth plates provide relatively precise information. In adults, however, age estimation becomes more complex. Anthropologists examine the wear patterns on teeth, the surface changes of the pubic symphysis, cranial suture closure, and degenerative changes in joints. These indicators shift gradually, and their interpretation relies on comparison with modern reference populations. When applied across assemblages, they create approximate age categories such as young adult, middle adult, and older adult across many late Ice Age and early Holocene sites. The distribution of these categories follows a similar pattern. There is a noticeable concentration of individuals in young and middle adulthood, with fewer confidently assigned to old age, even allowing for error margins in age estimation. The trend remains consistent. The skeletal features associated with older adulthood, such as severe joint degeneration or extensive cranial suture closure, are present, but not dominant. This pattern aligns with demographic expectations for populations experiencing high death rates earlier in life. It suggests that while some people survived into later decades, they did not make up a large proportion of the community. Skeletal preservation also shapes interpretation. Older individuals may have had more brittle bones, potentially reducing preservation quality. However, juvenile bones are often even more fragile, yet they are still found in significant numbers in many sites. The relative frequency of juvenile and young adult remains compared to elderly remains supports the view that early death was common. Moreover, repeated patterns across geographically distant regions strengthen the conclusion. From African sites associated with early humans to Eurasian Upper Stone Age contexts, age at death profiles frequently show a pyramid-like structure rather than a rectangular one. Evidence of long-term survival after injury provides nuance. Some skeletons display healed fractures of limbs, ribs, or even cranial trauma, indicating that injured individuals were cared for and survived long enough for bone remodeling. This demonstrates that prehistoric communities were capable of supporting members through periods of vulnerability. Yet even with such support, the number of skeletons clearly exhibiting decades of advanced degeneration remains relatively small. Care extended life in individual cases, but it did not transform the overall population structure into one dominated by old people. Going back to the deep African origins of our species clarifies the continuity of these findings. For most of human existence, life unfolded under environmental and biological constraints that limited how many people reached late adulthood. The skeletal record, despite its incompleteness, repeatedly reflects this limitation. Old age is visible in the bones, but it occupies the margins rather than the center of prehistoric age distributions. The archaeological evidence, therefore, reinforces the broader argument: aging occurred. Yet a widespread elderly class did not characterize most of human history. While skeletal evidence shows that some people survived into later decades, the broader archaeological context reveals how exceptional those cases often were. In many prehistoric burial grounds, the number of individuals identified as clearly elderly remains small relative to total burials. Even when using cautious age categories, such as over 50 or older adult, the proportion rarely approaches the levels seen in modern populations. This recurring pattern across different regions and time periods suggests that limited elder representation was not an isolated anomaly, but a structural feature of early human demographics. Burial contexts also provide insight into social recognition of age. In certain sites, older individuals appear to have been treated with care in death, sometimes buried with tools, ornaments, or pigments. These practices imply that age did not diminish social belonging. However, respectful burial does not equal numerical prevalence. A community may value its elders deeply, even if only a few individuals reach that stage. The rarity of elderly remains combined with evidence of care suggest that old age was meaningful precisely because it was uncommon. From a population perspective, this scarcity can be visualized as a narrow peak on top of a wide base. High birth rates and significant juvenile death created a broad lower layer. Adult hazards further reduced group size. By the time people approached their 6th or 7th decade, only a small fraction of the original birth group remained. This structure contrasts sharply with the rectangular age distribution seen in many contemporary societies where surviving into old age is common and predictable. The archaeological record thus captures not only individual lifespans, but also the shape of entire populations. It is important to acknowledge limitations: preservation bias, incomplete excavation, and methodological uncertainty all influence skeletal samples. Not every death left recoverable remains. Not every burial has been discovered. Even so, When independent sites across continents reveal similar age at death distributions, the pattern gains strength. The repeated underrepresentation of elderly individuals aligns with ecological and biological evidence discussed earlier. It suggests that the rarity of old age was not merely theoretical, but materially reflected in human remains. Going back to the deep African origins of early humans emphasizes how long this population pattern persisted. For almost 300,000 years, small mobile groups navigated environments without modern medical support. The skeletal fragments we recover today represent only a fraction of that immense time span. Yet they echo a consistent theme: aging occurred, but it did not dominate the population structure. Old people existed, and some survived long enough to accumulate visible degenerative changes. However, their numbers remained limited. The archaeological record, therefore, provides a quiet confirmation of the broader argument. For most of human history, old age was not absent, but it was uncommon enough that societies were not numerically shaped around it. The bones themselves preserve this demographic truth. When we shift from bones to social structure, another dimension of the absence of widespread old age becomes visible. In small hunter-gatherer groups, which resemble the social organization of early humans, the number of people in each age category shaped how roles were distributed. If only a few members of a group reached old age, their social position differed from that of elders in a society where they formed a large part of the population. The structure of authority, knowledge transmission, and daily labor was influenced not only by cultural values, but by numerical proportions. In a community of 30 or 40 people, a single elder represented a rare keeper of long-term memory rather than the head of a large generation of old people. Ethnographic observations of recent foraging societies offer cautious comparisons. In many such groups, older adults contribute through storytelling, mediating disputes, childcare, and specialized knowledge of landscapes and resources. Their experience carries weight, yet decision-making often remains relatively equal. Authority is not concentrated solely in age, partly because age itself is not numerically dominant. When elders are few, leadership structures tend to remain distributed among competent adults in their prime years. This pattern may resemble aspects of early human societies where survival required collaboration among physically capable people. Mobility further shaped the social role of age. Frequent movement across territories limited the development of fixed hierarchies tied to property or inherited status. In highly mobile groups, social cohesion depended on cooperation rather than rigid stratification. If elders were relatively rare, they were integrated into this flexible structure rather than forming a distinct governing class. Their influence came from experience rather than from being the majority. The absence of a large elderly population therefore influenced not only survival statistics, but also the architecture of social organization. Generational layering in such communities was shallow. Parents and children formed the core of daily interaction. Grandparents were present in some cases, but great-grandparental overlap was uncommon. The rhythm of knowledge transfer adapted to this compression. Skills in hunting, gathering, tool production, and navigation had to be transmitted while adults were still active and physically engaged. There was little expectation of decades devoted primarily to reflection. After productive labor ended, social planning operated within shorter time horizons because the turnover of generations was faster. Going back to the African origins of our species emphasizes how long this pattern persisted. For almost 300,000 years, human groups remained small and mobile. The demographic pyramid described earlier influenced not only who survived, but how societies were structured.